Elias woke with a gasp, his heart slamming against his ribs, certain that something was standing outside his window. The room was dark except for a thin line of moonlight cutting across the floor, and for a moment he could not breathe. He lay frozen under his blanket, listening. There was no growl, no footstep, no scratch of claws on wood, only silence. Yet his instincts, the quiet Omega instincts he had learned never to ignore, told him someone had been close, very close. He sat up slowly and turned toward the window, his breath caught in his throat. There, resting neatly on the wooden ledge, was a rabbit. It was fresh, its fur unmarked except for the single clean wound at its neck, placed with a precision that felt almost deliberate. Elias stared at it for a long moment, unsure whether to be afraid or confused. This was the third night in a row. He rose from the bed, wrapping a thin blanket around his shoulders, and approached the window with careful steps. The night air was cold against his face, as he leaned forward and looked out into the dark line of trees that bordered the Omega quarters. Nothing moved. No eyes glowed back at him from the shadows. Whatever had left the gift was already gone, vanished into the forest as silently as it had come. Elias closed the window and latched it, though he knew a latch would do little against a wolf determined to get through. He looked down at the rabbit again, turning it over in his hands. It was too clean to be a scavenger's kill, too perfect to be random. Someone, or something, wanted him to have this. He did not sleep again that night. By morning, the pack grounds were already alive with movement. Warriors trained in the yard below, their shouts echoing off the stone walls of the old keep. Servants hurried between buildings carrying baskets of bread and firewood. Elias made his way through the crowd with his head low, the way Omegas were taught to move, small and unnoticed, careful never to draw the eye of anyone stronger. He had lived this way his whole life, ever since his parents had died, and left him with nothing but a modest cottage near the edge of Packland, and a status that made him invisible to most of Blackthorn Pack. He found his friend Mira near the well, filling a bucket with water. She looked up when she saw him and immediately narrowed her eyes. "You look terrible," she said. "Did you not sleep again?" "There was another rabbit," Elias admitted, keeping his voice low. "On my windowsill. Third night in a row." Mira's eyebrows shot up. She set down the bucket and stepped closer, lowering her own voice to match his. "Third night? Elias, that is not normal. Foxes do not leave gifts. Foxes steal chickens and run." "I know," he said. "I don't understand it either. Have you told anyone?" He shook his head. "Who would believe me? An Omega claiming a wild animal is leaving him food every night? They would laugh. Or worse, they would think I am inventing excuses to draw attention to myself." Mira studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted, thoughtful and a little wary. "Elias, what if it is not a fox at all?" "Then what?" "A wolf does that," she said carefully. "A wolf that wants to court someone leaves food. It is old instinct, from before pack laws and titles and everything else. A wolf brings meat to the one it wants as a mate. It is not something they teach anymore, not since packs became more civilized, but the old wolves still remember it in their blood." Elias felt a strange chill move through him, though the morning sun was warm on his shoulders. "That's absurd," he said quickly. "No wolf in this pack would want anything to do with me. I'm an Omega, with no title, no family standing, nothing to offer." "I'm only saying what I know," Mira said, lifting her hands in a small shrug. "Someone is watching your window closely enough to know exactly when to leave something there without being seen. That is not carelessness, that is intention." Elias did not have an answer for that, and the conversation moved on to safer topics: the price of grain, the upcoming harvest festival, whether Mira's brother would finally propose to the baker's daughter. But the thought stayed lodged in Elias's mind for the rest of the day, refusing to loosen its grip no matter how hard he tried to push it away. Across the pack grounds, inside the great stone keep that rose above every other building in Blackthorn territory, Alpha King Draven Blackthorn woke to the feeling of dirt beneath his fingernails. He lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling of his chamber, trying to piece together the fragments of the night before. He remembered going to bed at a reasonable hour after a long council meeting. He remembered closing his eyes. And then nothing. A black gap in his memory that stretched from midnight until dawn, the kind of gap that had been happening more and more often lately. He lifted his hand and examined it in the pale morning light. There was dirt under 3 of his nails, and a faint, unfamiliar ache in his legs, as if he had run a great distance during the night. His wolf stirred inside him, calm and strangely pleased, offering no explanation, only a quiet satisfaction that unsettled Draven more than outright guilt would have. He rose and dressed quickly, forcing himself not to dwell on it. As alpha of one of the largest and most respected packs in the region, he could not afford to appear unsteady, not even to himself. He had ruled Blackthorn Pack for 6 years, since his father's death, and in that time he had built a reputation for control, discipline, and unshakable authority. A king whose wolf slipped its leash in the night was not the image he intended to present to anyone, least of all his own council. He found his beta, Corwin, waiting for him in the war room when he arrived, maps and reports already spread across the long table. Corwin had served beside Draven since they were boys training together in the yard, and there were few people in the pack who knew Draven as well as he did. "You look like you didn't sleep," Corwin said without looking up from the map he was studying. "I slept fine," Draven said, taking his seat at the head of the table. Corwin finally lifted his eyes, studying his alpha, with the kind of careful attention that came from years of friendship. "Your wolf's been restless again. I could feel it through the bond during the pack meeting yesterday. Something's got him worked up." "It's nothing," Draven said, though even as he spoke the words, he felt the lie settle uncomfortably in his chest. "There have been reports of foxes near the Omega quarters. Stealing livestock, disturbing the smaller dwellings at night. I've been dealing with it." This was not entirely untrue. There had been complaints, vague ones, about strange movement near the edge of the Omega district after dark. Draven had simply assumed, without much thought, that his own restless nights and those reports were connected, that his wolf's disturbed sleep was somehow tied to hunting down whatever pest was disturbing the pack's peace. "Foxes," Corwin repeated, unconvinced. "You're the alpha king of one of the strongest packs in the region, and you're losing sleep over foxes. It reflects poorly on us, if predators are allowed to roam freely, so close to where our people live," Draven said, his tone sharpening slightly, the tone that ended most arguments before they truly began. "I want extra patrols near the Omega quarters starting tonight. Have the warriors sweep the tree line and report anything unusual." Corwin held his gaze for a moment longer, clearly wanting to say more, but he only nodded, and made a note on the parchment in front of him. "As you wish, Alpha." The day continued much as any other. Draven met with the council to discuss the upcoming trade agreement with the neighboring Ashwood pack. He settled a dispute between 2 warriors over territory boundaries. He reviewed reports from the pack's border scouts. Through it all, a low hum of unease sat beneath his ribs, his wolf pacing somewhere in the back of his mind, restless and waiting, though for what, Draven could not say. It was late afternoon when he decided, somewhat impulsively, to walk the perimeter of the Omega quarters himself. He told himself it was simply due diligence, that a good alpha inspected potential problems personally rather than relying entirely on reports from others. He told himself this was about the foxes, about protecting his people, about nothing more complicated than that. The Omega district sat at the eastern edge of pack territory, a cluster of modest cottages and small gardens, quieter and less grand than the buildings closer to the keep. Draven walked its narrow paths with his hands clasped behind his back, nodding occasionally to Omegas who bowed as he passed, his expression carefully neutral, his mind only half present. And then he saw him. Elias was kneeling in front of a small garden bed near his cottage, pulling weeds from between rows of herbs, his sleeves pushed up to his elbows, dirt smudged along one forearm. He had not yet noticed the Alpha's approach, too absorbed in his work, humming quietly to himself, in a way that seemed entirely unguarded, entirely unaware of being watched. Draven stopped walking. Something shifted inside him, a strange and sudden calm that spread through his chest, like warmth from a fire. His wolf, restless all day, went utterly still, utterly focused, watching the kneeling Omega with an intensity that made Draven's own breath catch. It was not aggression, it was not hunger, it was something else entirely, something that felt disturbingly close to recognition. He did not understand it, and he did not like not understanding it. Elias looked up then, sensing the weight of someone's attention, and his eyes met Draven's directly. For a moment neither of them moved. Elias's cheeks flushed, and he scrambled to his feet, bowing quickly, his composure cracking just slightly at the unexpected sight of the Alpha King standing on the path outside his home. "Alpha," he said, his voice a little breathless. "I did not expect—" "Is something wrong?" Draven realized he had been staring and forced himself to speak, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. "There have been reports of predators near the Omega quarters. I'm inspecting the area." "Oh," Elias said, straightening. "I haven't seen anything unusual myself, except—" He hesitated, clearly debating whether to say more. "Except what?" Draven asked, and he was surprised by how genuinely he wanted to hear the answer. Elias glanced down at his garden, then back up, choosing his words carefully. "There have been rabbits left on my windowsill these past few nights. Fresh ones. I assumed it might be a fox at first, but Mira, my friend, thinks it might be something else." Draven felt something cold slide down his spine, a terrible, creeping suspicion he did not want to examine too closely. "Something else," he repeated slowly. "She thinks it might be a wolf," Elias said, and then seemed to catch himself, embarrassed. "Which is ridiculous, I know. No wolf in this pack would have any reason to leave gifts at my window." Draven's wolf, silent and watchful throughout the entire conversation, chose that exact moment to surge forward, with a feeling so powerful it nearly knocked the breath from Draven's lungs. "Mate." The word arrived not in language but in pure sensation, an undeniable, bone-deep certainty that settled into every part of him at once. Draven took a step back, his expression carefully blank despite the storm rising inside him. "I'm sure it's nothing more than an animal with unusual habits," he said, his voice tighter than he intended. "I'll have the patrols keep watch." "Thank you, Alpha," Elias said, bowing again, clearly relieved to have the strange conversation reach its end. Draven turned and walked away, without another word, his pace quickening the moment he was out of sight of the Omega District, his mind spinning with a realization he was not ready to face. His wolf had been leaving those rabbits. His wolf had been slipping out at night, unnoticed, unremembered, walking straight to Elias's window, with a kill in its jaws like some ancient courting ritual out of the oldest stories. He did not want it to be true. He told himself, again and again as he walked, that there had to be another explanation, that his wolf's reaction meant nothing more than curiosity, that the dirt under his nails and the ache in his legs had some ordinary cause he simply hadn't considered yet. But deep inside him, beneath the layers of denial he was already constructing, his wolf pressed against his ribs with quiet, unshakable certainty, and Draven knew, with a dread that settled heavy in his stomach, that the truth was far more complicated than foxes. That night, sleep did not come easily to either of them. Elias lay awake in his small bed, staring at the ceiling, turning Mira's words over and over in his mind. "A wolf that wants to court someone leaves food." He thought of the Alpha King's strange, intense stare on the garden path, the way the powerful man had seemed almost shaken by their brief conversation, and told himself firmly that he was imagining connections that did not exist. Alphas like Draven Blackthorn did not court Omegas like him. It simply did not happen. Across the pack grounds, in his chamber high in the stone keep, Draven paced the length of his room, until the candles burned low, his wolf pressing at the edges of his control, with a patience that felt, for the first time, deliberate rather than random. He was afraid, though he would never have admitted it to anyone, not even to Corwin. He was afraid that his wolf already understood something that his human mind was not yet ready to accept. Somewhere near midnight, exhaustion finally won, and Draven's eyes grew heavy despite his best efforts to stay alert, to stay in control. The last thing he registered before sleep pulled him under was his wolf stirring with quiet anticipation, as if it already knew exactly where the night would lead. When Draven woke the next morning, there was dirt under his nails again. And somewhere across the pack grounds, on a windowsill outside a small cottage at the edge of the Omega quarters, a fourth rabbit lay waiting in the pale morning light, placed with the same careful precision as all the others, a silent promise from a wolf that refused to be ignored. Corwin found Draven standing at the edge of the training yard the next morning, staring out toward the eastern tree line with an expression that made the beta pause before approaching. He had known Draven long enough to recognize the difference between the Alpha's usual composed silence and whatever this was, something tighter, more coiled, like a man holding his breath and refusing to admit it. The patrols found nothing again last night, Corwin said, coming to stand beside him. No fox tracks, no signs of any predator at all near the Omega quarters. Then they weren't looking hard enough, Draven said. They combed the entire tree line twice, Corwin said. Draven, I've served you long enough to know when something is wrong. Talk to me. Draven's jaw tightened. For a moment, he considered simply walking away, retreating to the safety of silence, the way he always had, whenever a problem felt too large to name aloud. But the weight of the last few nights, the dirt under his nails, the ache in his legs, the terrible clarity of that single word his wolf had offered him in the Omega district, pressed against him, until he could not hold it back any longer. It isn't foxes, Draven said quietly. Corwin frowned. What do you mean? I mean it's me, Draven said, and the words tasted strange and heavy in his mouth, as if speaking them made the truth more solid, harder to deny. My wolf. He's the one going out at night. He's the one leaving the rabbits. Corwin stared at him for a long moment, clearly trying to determine whether his alpha was joking. When he realized Draven was entirely serious, his expression shifted into something more careful. Leaving rabbits for who? Draven hesitated, and that hesitation told Corwin everything, before Draven even said the name. There's an Omega. Elias lives at the edge of the district, near the old well. You've been courting an Omega in your sleep, Corwin said slowly, testing the words as if they might rearrange themselves into something more sensible if he said them differently. I haven't been courting anyone, Draven snapped, more sharply than he intended. My wolf has been acting without my permission. There's a difference. Is there? Corwin asked, not unkindly, but with the directness that had always made him useful to Draven, precisely because he refused to simply agree with whatever his alpha wanted to hear. Your wolf doesn't act on nothing, Draven. You know this. A wolf that consistently brings food to one specific person, without command, without hesitation, night after night, that isn't random behavior. That's instinct responding to something real. It's a mistake, Draven said. A malfunction. Perhaps some illness, some disruption in the bond between us. You don't believe that, Corwin said quietly. Draven did not answer, because Corwin was right, and they both knew it. Deep in his chest, where the bond between man and wolf lived, there was no confusion, no illness, no malfunction. There was only certainty, calm and immovable, the kind of certainty that came only once in a wolf's life, when it recognized its true mate. Even if it were true, Draven said finally, forcing his voice into something steadier, it changes nothing. I am the Alpha King. My mate, if such a thing exists, cannot be an Omega, with no family standing, no political value, no claim to anything beyond a small cottage and a garden. The council would never accept it. The pack would see it as weakness. The pack sees strength in an alpha who is honest, Corwin said. Not one who spends his nights lying to himself about where his wolf goes. Draven turned away from the tree line, unwilling to continue the conversation any further. I need you to increase patrols near the Omega quarters, he said, his tone leaving no room for further discussion. Not to look for foxes, to make certain my wolf doesn't do anything else without my knowledge. Corwin studied him for a long moment, clearly unhappy with the deflection, but he had served under Draven long enough to know when pushing further would accomplish nothing. As you wish, Alpha, he said, though his tone carried a note of quiet disappointment that lingered in the air between them even after he walked away. That evening, Draven retreated to his private chamber earlier than usual, determined to confront the problem directly, rather than allow it to continue unchecked. He had read, in his youth, about the old practice of meditative communion, a technique some alphas used to speak more directly with the wolf half of themselves, to negotiate rather than simply suppress. He had never needed it before. His wolf had always been obedient, disciplined, content to remain quiet unless called upon in battle or ceremony. He sat cross-legged on the floor of his chamber, closed his eyes, and reached inward, searching for the presence that had been growing louder and more insistent with each passing day. His wolf met him without hesitation, eager in a way that startled Draven, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. Why do you fight me? The wolf asked, not in words exactly, but in impressions and instincts that Draven's mind translated into something resembling language. I have found what we have searched for. You've made a mistake, Draven answered, though even as he formed the thought, it felt hollow. unconvincing even to himself. He is an Omega, untitled. It cannot be him. Titles are human things, the wolf said, and there was something almost amused in the response, a patience that felt ancient, far older than Draven's 6 years as Alpha. I do not choose by title. I choose by truth. He is ours. You cannot simply decide this without me, Draven said, frustration rising in his chest. I am the one who must answer to the council, to the pack, to everything you seem determined to ignore. I did not decide, the wolf answered. I recognized. There is a difference, as you told your beta this morning. You know this is true. You have known since the moment you saw him kneeling in the garden. Draven opened his eyes abruptly, breaking the connection before the conversation could continue any further, his heart pounding as if he had run a great distance rather than simply sat still in his own chamber. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, trying to steady his breathing, trying to force some order back into thoughts that refused to settle. He told himself, as he had told himself every day since the rabbits began appearing, that this could be managed, controlled, contained. He was the Alpha King. He had faced border wars, political betrayals, the sudden death of his father, and the crushing weight of a crown he had not expected to wear so young. Surely he could manage something as simple as an inconvenient instinct. But even as he thought it, he knew, with the same bone-deep certainty his wolf had offered him days earlier, that this was not something that could be managed. It was not a border dispute or a political negotiation. It was a bond, ancient and absolute, and no amount of denial from the human half of him would be enough to make it disappear. He did not sleep well that night either, though this time it was not fear that kept him awake, but the growing, unwelcome awareness that his wolf had been right about something Draven was not yet ready to admit aloud, not to Corwin, not to the council, and certainly not to himself. 3 days passed in careful, watchful silence. The patrols Draven had ordered swept the tree line near the Omega quarters each night, warriors moving through the shadows with torches and sharp eyes, searching for a fox that did not exist. They found nothing, of course, because there was nothing to find beyond an alpha whose wolf slipped free of his control the moment sleep loosened its grip. Elias, for his part, noticed the change immediately. Warriors he did not recognize began appearing near his cottage each evening, walking slow, deliberate circuits around the perimeter of the Omega district, their attention seeming to linger more heavily near his particular corner of the settlement than anywhere else. He mentioned it to Mira one afternoon while they sat together shelling peas on her front step, the sun warm and low in the sky. They've had patrols out every night this week, Elias said, ever since the Alpha King himself walked through here. Mira raised an eyebrow, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. And you still think this has nothing to do with you? It has to do with foxes, Elias said, though even he could hear how unconvinced he sounded. Foxes, Mira repeated flatly. Elias, when was the last time anyone in this pack organized nightly patrols over a fox problem? We've had foxes near the chicken coops for years. No one has ever sent warriors to guard them. Elias did not have a response for that. He focused instead on the peas in his lap, avoiding Mira's knowing look, though he could feel the weight of her attention regardless. The rabbits stopped, though, he said after a moment, changing the subject deliberately. 4 nights now, nothing. Maybe your wolf got caught, Mira said with a teasing lilt, and Elias shot her a sharp look that only made her laugh. He is not my wolf, Elias said firmly. There is no wolf. There was never a wolf. But even as he said it, some small, quiet part of him, the part he tried hardest to ignore, wondered whether the sudden appearance of extra patrols and the equally sudden disappearance of the rabbits were connected in a way that had very little to do with foxes at all. The council chamber was colder than usual that morning, or perhaps it only felt that way to Draven, who sat at the head of the long stone table, with his hands folded in front of him, trying to focus on the reports being read aloud by Elder Percival, the oldest and most respected member of the Blackthorn Council. Percival had served 3 alphas before Draven, and his voice carried the kind of authority that came from decades of experience rather than mere title. The Ashwood Pack has agreed to the terms of the trade route through the Northern Valley, Percival said, adjusting the parchment in his weathered hands. They ask only that we guarantee safe passage for their merchants during the autumn migration. Agreed, Draven said, though his attention was only partially on the discussion. His wolf had been unusually quiet since their conversation 3 nights earlier, a silence that felt less like peace and more like patience, as if it were simply waiting for Draven to exhaust himself with denial before pressing forward again. "There is one more matter," Percival continued, and something in his tone shifted, careful and deliberate, in a way that immediately drew Draven's full attention. "Reports have reached the Council regarding unusual patrol activity near the Omega quarters. Extensive patrols, ordered directly by you, Alpha, in response to what has been described as a Fox problem." Draven felt the eyes of every council member turned toward him, and he kept his expression carefully neutral, the same mask he had worn through countless negotiations and disputes. "There have been disturbances near the Omega district," he said. "I take the safety of every member of this pack seriously, regardless of their status." "Of course," Percival said, though his tone suggested he was not entirely satisfied with the answer. "It is simply unusual for an Alpha King to personally inspect the area and order nightly patrols over what has, so far, produced no evidence of any predator. Some among the council have begun to wonder if there is more to the matter than foxes." Draven's stomach tightened, though he kept his face impassive. "The council should focus on matters of actual consequence," he said, his voice carrying the sharp edge of finality that usually ended such lines of questioning. "The trade agreement with Ashwood, the border tensions with the Ironclaw pack. These are the concerns that deserve our attention, not idle speculation about patrol assignments." Percival held his gaze for a long moment, and Draven had the uncomfortable sense that the old elder saw far more than he was letting on, but the elder inclined his head and let the matter drop, at least for now. "As you say, Alpha." The meeting continued for another hour, moving through matters of trade, territory, and the upcoming Harvest Festival that would bring representatives from 3 neighboring packs to Blackthorn territory for a week of negotiations and celebration. Draven answered questions and offered opinions with practiced ease, but beneath the surface, his mind kept circling back to Percival's pointed comment, to the growing awareness that his secret, if it could even still be called that, was no longer as contained as he had hoped. After the meeting ended and the council members filed out, Corwin lingered behind, waiting until the chamber had emptied before speaking. "Percival isn't a fool," he said. "None of them are. If you keep ordering patrols with no explanation, they'll keep asking questions." "Let them ask," Draven said, gathering the reports scattered across the table with more force than necessary. "I answer to no one but myself." "You answer to the pack," Corwin corrected gently. "That's what being Alpha means. And pretending your wolf isn't doing exactly what we both know he's doing isn't answering anything. It's avoiding it." Draven set the reports down and rubbed a hand over his face, the exhaustion of too many restless nights finally catching up with him. "What would you have me do, Corwin?" "Announce to the entire council that my wolf has apparently chosen an Omega with no standing, no family, nothing to offer this pack politically, and that I have no control over it whatsoever? They would question my fitness to rule. They would see it as exactly the kind of weakness Percival's generation has always feared in younger alphas. Or they would see an alpha honest enough to acknowledge the truth of his own bond," Corwin said. "You assume the worst of them, Draven, but you've never actually given them the chance to react to the truth. You've only imagined how they might." Draven did not answer, because he did not have a good response, only the same tangled knot of fear and denial that had kept him circling this same argument for days without resolution. He left the council chamber without another word, retreating to the training yard where physical exertion had always offered him a clearer head than quiet reflection ever did. He spent the following hours sparring with 2 of his best warriors, driving himself harder than usual, pushing his body until sweat soaked through his shirt, and his muscles burned with the effort. It helped, for a while. The physical exhaustion quieted the noise in his head, gave him something simple and immediate to focus on, instead of the impossible question of what to do about Elias. But even exhaustion could not keep his wolf silent forever. That evening, as Draven sat alone in his chamber, picking at a meal he had little appetite for, his wolf stirred again, restless and insistent, pressing against the edges of his control, with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. "You cannot keep me from him forever," the wolf said, the impression arriving with quiet, unshakable certainty. "Each night you deny me grows harder than the last." "I am not denying you anything," Draven answered, though the lie felt weaker each time he told it. "I am protecting this pack, protecting him, if you must know, from the consequences of a bond that would make him a target for every enemy this crown has ever made. You are protecting yourself, the wolf said, and there was no anger in the observation, only a patient, knowing calm, that Draven found more unsettling than outright confrontation would have been. From fear, from change, from admitting that the crown you wear so carefully does not have to come at the cost of everything else. Draven pushed away from the table, unwilling to continue the conversation, though he knew, deep down, that walking away from his own thoughts solved nothing. He extinguished the candles in his chamber and lay down, determined to sleep through the night without incident, determined to prove, if only to himself, that he still held control over his own body. Sleep came slowly, reluctantly, and when it finally arrived, it was shallow and restless, filled with fragmented images that made little sense. A garden path, dirt beneath his hands, the warm scent of herbs and morning sun. He woke sometime before dawn with his heart racing, certain that something had happened, though he could not immediately recall what. He lifted his hands in the dim light and found them clean, no dirt beneath the nails this time. Relief flooded through him, quick and overwhelming, and he allowed himself a single, ragged breath before rising to check the rest of his chamber, searching for any sign that his wolf had slipped free during the night. There was nothing out of place. His boots stood exactly where he had left them by the door. His window remained latched from the inside. For the first time in nearly a week, it seemed his wolf had remained obedient through the night, restrained by whatever combination of exhaustion and willpower Draven had managed to summon. He allowed himself to believe, for a brief and foolish moment, that perhaps the worst of it had passed, that his wolf's insistence had simply been a passing disturbance, rather than the beginning of something far larger and more permanent. That fragile relief lasted only until he made his way to the training yard later that morning and found Corwin waiting for him, with an expression that immediately told Draven something was wrong. "There's a problem," Corwin said, keeping his voice low despite the empty yard around them. "What kind of problem?" "One of the patrol warriors came to me this morning," Corwin said. "He says he saw something near the Omega quarters last night. Something large moving through the trees, close to the district, though he couldn't get a clear look before it vanished." Draven's chest tightened. "Did he see what it was?" "He said it moved like a wolf," Corwin said carefully, watching Draven's face for a reaction. "A large one. Bigger than any wolf in this pack, he claims, though it was dark, and he admits he might be mistaken." Draven's mind raced back to the shallow, restless sleep of the previous night, the fragmented images of a garden path and warm sunlight, images that felt less like dreams now, and more like fractured memories struggling to surface. He had assumed, in his relief, that his wolf had remained contained. But if the warrior's report was accurate, that assumption had been wrong.
"Does anyone else know?"
Draven asked, keeping his voice carefully controlled despite the alarm building in his chest.
"Not yet,"
Corwin said. "The warrior reported it to me directly, as I instructed the patrols to do with anything unusual. But Draven, if this continues, if more warriors start seeing a large wolf moving through the Omega district at night, questions are going to multiply far beyond what Percival raised in council yesterday. People will start connecting the pattern themselves, whether you choose to explain it or not." Draven closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him, with a force that made even his considerable self-discipline feel inadequate. His wolf had slipped free again, despite every effort at control, despite exhaustion and willpower, and every trick Draven had attempted to hold it in place. And now witnesses, however uncertain, were beginning to notice.
"I need to speak with him," Draven said finally, the decision arriving with a suddenness that surprised even himself.
"Speak with who?" Corwin asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. "Elias," Draven said, the name feeling strange and heavy on his tongue, an admission wrapped inside a simple statement. "I need to understand what my wolf is doing, and I cannot do that by continuing to avoid the one person at the center of it." Corwin studied him for a long moment, something like cautious relief crossing his features. "That's the first sensible thing you've said about this in a week." Draven did not respond to that, already turning the decision over in his mind, uncertain exactly what he would say or how he would explain himself, only certain that avoidance had reached its limit, and that the time for careful denial was quickly running out. Elias was hanging laundry on a line strung between two posts behind his cottage when he heard footsteps approaching along the path, too heavy and deliberate to belong to Mira or any of the other Omegas who sometimes visited. He turned, a damp shirt still in his hands, and felt his breath catch when he saw Draven standing at the edge of his small yard, dressed simply, without the formal cloak he usually wore during official pack business. "Alpha," Elias said, quickly setting the shirt aside and straightening his posture, though he could not entirely smooth the surprise from his expression. "I wasn't expecting you." "I didn't send word ahead," Draven admitted, and there was something almost awkward in the way he stood, hands clasped behind his back, shoulders set in a stance that looked more like bracing for impact than the confident authority he usually carried. "I hoped we might speak privately, if that's agreeable to you." Elias glanced around the small yard, uncertain what to make of the request, but nodded slowly. "Of course. Would you like to sit?" He gestured toward a pair of weathered wooden chairs near the cottage door, the kind meant for quiet evenings rather than formal audiences with an Alpha King. Draven took the offered seat, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching long enough that Elias began to fidget with the hem of his sleeve, uncertain whether he had done something wrong or whether this visit carried some other purpose entirely. "The patrols," Draven said finally. "Have they been a disturbance to you?" "No more than any unfamiliar warriors walking past my window every night," Elias said, a hint of dry humor slipping into his voice despite his nervousness. "Though I confess, I still don't understand what they're looking for." "The rabbits stopped appearing days ago." "Did they?" Draven said, and something in his tone made Elias look at him more closely, searching for a meaning beneath the simple words that he could not quite grasp. "You already knew that," Elias said slowly, watching Draven's face. "Didn't you?" Draven hesitated, and in that hesitation, Elias saw something he had never expected to see in the composed, controlled Alpha King: uncertainty, plain and unguarded, flickering across features that were usually so carefully arranged. "I came here to understand something," Draven said, choosing his words with obvious care. "Not to explain it. Not yet. Only to understand what you have experienced these past weeks, without judgment, without consequence. Will you tell me honestly?" Elias studied him for a long moment, weighing the strange request against every instinct that told him Omegas did not question Alphas, did not press for explanations, simply answered and moved on. But something about Draven's expression, the genuine uncertainty in it, made him decide to set that instinct aside, at least for this conversation. "The rabbits started appearing about 10 days ago," Elias said. "Always at night, always fresh, always placed with more care than any animal would bother with. Then, a few days after you visited my garden, they stopped completely, right around the time the patrols started." "And what did you make of that?" Draven asked. Elias hesitated, feeling heat rise in his cheeks despite himself. "Mira has a theory," he said carefully. "She thinks it might not have been a fox at all. She thinks it might have been a wolf, courting." "Courting who?" Draven asked, though his voice had gone quieter, more careful, as if he already suspected the answer, and was testing whether Elias would say it aloud. "Me," Elias said, the word feeling absurd even as he spoke it. "Which is ridiculous, obviously. I have no standing in this pack, no family connections worth mentioning. I can't imagine any wolf with sense would choose to court someone like me, let alone leave evidence of it for the entire pack to eventually notice." Draven was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed somewhere on the middle distance, and Elias had the strange sensation of watching a man wage some private, internal battle that had nothing to do with the words passing between them. "Why does that seem so impossible to you?" Draven asked finally, his voice low. The question caught Elias off guard. "Because it's true," he said. "Omegas without standing don't get chosen for anything beyond arranged pairings, meant to secure alliances or favors for someone else's benefit. That's simply how things work in this pack, and in most others." "That's how things have worked," Draven said. "It doesn't mean that's how they must continue." Elias stared at him, trying to understand what exactly was happening, why the Alpha King of Blackthorn Pack was sitting in a worn wooden chair outside a modest cottage, speaking about courting and standing, and possibility, as if the conversation carried weight far beyond idle curiosity. His heart began to beat faster. though he could not have said whether it was from fear or something else entirely, something warmer and far more dangerous to acknowledge. "Alpha," Elias said carefully, "is there something you came here to tell me?" For a moment, Draven looked as though he might finally answer honestly, his mouth opening slightly, the words visibly forming behind his eyes. But then something shifted in his expression, a familiar tightening, the mask sliding back into place with practiced ease, and Elias watched the opportunity close as quickly as it had opened. "I came to ask whether the patrols have troubled you," Draven said, his voice returning to its usual measured control. "That is all. I apologize if my questions carried more weight than intended." Disappointment settled in Elias's chest, sharp and unexpected, though he tried to keep it from showing on his face. "The patrols haven't troubled me, Alpha," he said, matching Draven's retreat into formality. "Thank you for asking." Draven rose from the chair, his movements stiff, almost hurried, as if he were eager to escape a conversation that had veered too close to something he was not yet ready to face. "I should return to the keep," he said. "Thank you for your time, Elias." It was the first time he had used Elias's name directly, and something about the way he said it, careful and deliberate, as though testing the shape of it in his mouth, sent a small shiver down Elias's spine. "Of course, Alpha," Elias said, rising as well, watching as Draven turned and walked back down the path toward the keep, his pace quickening with every step, as though putting distance between himself and the conversation might somehow undo whatever had almost been said. Elias stood in his yard for a long time after Draven disappeared from view, replaying the strange exchange in his mind, searching for meaning in every pause, every hesitation, every unfinished sentence. Mira's theory, which had seemed so absurd only days earlier, now sat heavier in his thoughts, refusing to be dismissed as easily as before. That evening, as the sun sank low over the packlands, Elias found himself standing at his window long after he should have gone to bed, staring out at the dark tree line, waiting for something he could not name, some sign that would confirm or deny the impossible suspicion growing steadily inside him. Nothing appeared, no rabbit, no shadow moving between the trees, only silence and moonlight, and the steady, distant sound of patrol warriors making their rounds along the edge of the district. He finally climbed into bed, telling himself firmly that whatever strange energy had passed between himself and the Alpha King that afternoon meant nothing beyond ordinary curiosity, that he was reading far too much into a few careful words and a hurried departure. But sleep came slowly, and when it finally did, his dreams were filled with golden eyes watching him from the tree line, patient, warm, and unmistakably familiar. Draven barely slept that night, his mind circling endlessly around the conversation in Elias's yard, the way the words he had meant to say kept dissolving into safer, emptier ones the moment they reached his mouth. He lay in the dark long after the candles had burned out, staring at the ceiling, his wolf pressing quietly against his ribs, patient in a way that felt almost like disappointment. "You had him in front of you," the wolf said eventually, when Draven's resistance had worn thin enough to let the thought through. "You had the truth in your mouth, and you chose the crown instead." "It isn't that simple," Draven answered, though even to himself the argument sounded tired, worn down from repetition. "There are consequences to consider. Consequences you don't think about, because you don't have to sit in council meetings or answer to elders who have led this pack longer than I've been alive." "I think about him," the wolf said simply. "That is all I think about. You are the one who thinks about everything else." Draven had no answer for that, and eventually, exhaustion pulled him under despite the unresolved tension still coiled tight in his chest. His sleep, when it came, was deep and dreamless at first, the kind of total darkness that offered no warning of what was happening beneath the surface of his consciousness. He did not feel himself rise from the bed. He did not feel his body shift, bones and muscle rearranging themselves into a different shape entirely, fur replacing skin, the world sharpening into scent and sound in ways his human senses could never match. He did not feel his paws carry him silently down the stone corridors of the keep, past sleeping guards who never stirred, out through a side door his wolf somehow knew how to open without waking anyone. He felt nothing at all, until the cold night air hit his face, and his own eyes, wide and startled, blinked open, to find himself standing in darkness, breathing hard, his heart pounding with a confusion so total It took several seconds to understand what he was looking at. He was crouched low to the ground, human again, his bare feet pressed into damp earth, his hands braced against packed dirt at the base of a familiar cottage. Above him, close enough to touch if he simply reached up, was a window, its shutters closed against the night, moonlight catching faintly against the wooden frame. Elias's window. In his hand, gripped tightly enough that his fingers ached, was a rabbit, still warm, its fur soft against his palm. Draven froze, every part of him locked in place by a horror so complete it felt almost physical, a weight pressing down on his chest until he could barely breathe. He was here. He had shifted, walked through the pack grounds unseen, evaded every patrol he himself had ordered, and arrived exactly where his wolf had always intended, standing beneath Elias's window in the middle of the night, with a fresh kill in his hand, like some love-struck creature from the oldest stories his grandmother used to tell. He heard movement inside the cottage. Panic surged through him, sharp and immediate, and before he could think clearly, before he could decide what to do, or how to explain himself if the shutters opened, and Elias found him crouched in the dirt like a common thief, Draven turned and ran, moving low and fast through the shadows, his wolf's instincts guiding his human body, with an ease that unsettled him even as he used it to escape. He did not stop running until he reached the tree line at the edge of the district, where he finally paused, chest heaving, hands braced against his knees, the rabbit still clutched forgotten in his fist. He stared down at it, at the small, still creature he had carried across pack grounds in the dead of night, and felt something crack open inside him, some final wall of denial finally giving way under the weight of undeniable evidence. This was not a malfunction. This was not an illness or a mistake in the bond between man and wolf. This was choice, ancient and absolute, playing out night after night, regardless of how firmly Draven tried to deny it in the daylight hours. He sank down against the trunk of a tree, the rabbit still in his hand, and allowed himself, for the first time since this had all begun, to simply feel the full weight of what his wolf had been trying to tell him. Mate, not a mistake, not a malfunction. A truth so deep and so absolute that his own conscious will had proven powerless to stop it from acting on its own. He remained there until the first gray light of dawn began creeping through the trees, his mind slowly settling into something that felt less like panic and more like a terrible, unwanted clarity. He could not keep denying this. He could not keep ordering patrols to search for a threat that did not exist, could not keep sending his wolf's instincts to war against his own conscious will every single night, could not keep pretending, in council meetings and public appearances, that nothing had changed when everything had. But acceptance, he understood with equal clarity, would not be simple. Acceptance meant confronting a council that had already begun to ask uncomfortable questions. It meant risking the stability he had worked so hard to build in the 6 years since his father's death, the careful image of an unshakable alpha king that had kept rival packs cautious and his own people confident in his leadership. And it meant facing Elias, not with careful, unfinished sentences and hurried retreats, but with the full and complicated truth. Draven rose slowly, his legs stiff from sitting too long against the cold ground, and looked down at the rabbit still resting in his palm. He could not return it to the window now, not with dawn breaking and the risk of being seen by early rising patrol warriors. Instead, he carried it deeper into the trees and left it there, a strange, small act of surrender to instincts he no longer had the strength to fight. He made his way back to the keep through the last shadows of night, slipping in through the same side door his wolf had used to leave, grateful that exhaustion had apparently kept the guards from noticing his absence at all. He returned to his chamber, washed the dirt from his hands and feet, and sat on the edge of his bed as the sun rose fully over the packlands, staring at nothing, turning the events of the night over and over in his mind. By the time Corwin found him later that morning, Draven's expression had settled into something Corwin had not seen in weeks, not denial, not deflection, but a quiet, exhausted resolve that immediately caught his attention. "You look different," Corwin said carefully, studying his alpha's face. "I shifted last night," Draven said, the admission arriving without the resistance that had characterized every previous conversation on the subject. "I woke beneath his window. I was carrying a rabbit in my hand when I came back to myself." Corwin was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the confession. "What are you going to do?" Draven let out a slow breath, the weight of the question settling over him like a physical thing. I don't know yet, he admitted, but I know I cannot keep pretending this is something it isn't, not anymore. Corwin studied him for a moment longer, then nodded, something like cautious relief crossing his features for the second time in a week. That's a start, he said quietly. It's not everything, but it's a start. 2 days passed before Elias saw Draven again, and in that time, the strange dream he had woken from, golden eyes watching him from beyond his window, refused to fade the way most dreams did. He found himself returning to it at odd moments throughout the day, while kneading bread, while weeding the garden, while lying awake at night listening for sounds that never came. He had not told Mira about the dream, uncertain how to explain something that felt too intimate, too strange to put into ordinary words. But he had told her about the visit, about Draven sitting in his yard asking careful, unfinished questions, and Mira's reaction had been immediate and unambiguous. He came here himself, Elias, she said, setting down the mending in her lap to look at him directly. Alphas do not pay personal visits to Omegas to ask about patrol disturbances. That is what messengers are for. I know how it sounds, Elias admitted. I just don't understand why. What could the Alpha King possibly want with someone like me? Mira gave him a long, patient look, the kind she usually reserved for moments when she thought he was being deliberately obtuse. Perhaps he wants exactly what a wolf wants when it leaves fresh meat outside someone's window every night for over a week. Elias did not have an answer for that, and the conversation drifted elsewhere, though the unease it left behind lingered far longer than the words themselves. On the third morning, Elias woke to the sound of raised voices near the well, unusual enough to draw him outside despite the early hour. A small crowd had gathered, mostly Omegas and a few younger warriors, all watching as 2 patrol guards argued heatedly, with an older woman who kept insisting she had seen something the previous night. I know what I saw, the woman said firmly, her voice carrying across the gathered crowd. A wolf, larger than any in this pack, standing near the Omega cottages before it vanished into the trees. I've lived here 40 years. I know every wolf that runs with Blackthorn Pack, and that was not one of them. It was likely a trick of moonlight, one of the guards said, though his tone lacked real conviction. Shadows can play strange games at night. I know a shadow from a wolf, the woman snapped, clearly unwilling to let the matter drop. Elias felt a chill move through him as he listened, the pieces of the past 2 weeks arranging themselves into a shape he had been carefully avoiding. Fresh rabbits appearing overnight. Patrols suddenly increased around his specific corner of the district. Draven's strange, unfinished visit. And now a witness, claiming to have seen an unusually large wolf near the very cottages where the rabbits had first appeared. He made his way back to his own cottage, without waiting to hear the rest of the argument, his mind racing, his heart beating faster than the short walk should have warranted. He sat down heavily at his small kitchen table, staring at nothing, trying to make sense of a possibility that seemed both impossible and, increasingly, undeniable. If the wolf the woman had seen was connected to the rabbits, if that wolf belonged to someone within the pack rather than some wandering stray, then the list of alphas large and powerful enough to match her description was vanishingly small. And Draven's behavior over the past 2 weeks, the personal visit, the careful, unfinished questions, the strange intensity in his eyes whenever their conversations veered too close to certain topics, all of it began to fit together into a pattern Elias no longer had the ability to dismiss as coincidence. He spent the rest of the day distracted, his usual chores taking twice as long as they should have, his thoughts drifting constantly back to golden eyes in a dream, and an Alpha King who could not seem to finish his own sentences. That evening, as dusk settled over the packlands, Elias made a decision that surprised even himself. He would not wait passively for another cryptic visit, another unfinished conversation that left him with more questions than answers. If there was truth buried beneath all of this, he intended to find it himself, directly, rather than continuing to guess at shadows and half-spoken words. He waited until most of the district had settled for the night, until the patrol warriors had completed their first sweep of the evening, and then, wrapping a shawl around his shoulders against the evening chill, he made his way toward the keep, his heart hammering with a nervousness he refused to let slow his steps. He did not have a plan beyond simply asking, directly and without pretense, for the truth. It was a bold thing for an Omega to do, seeking an audience with the Alpha King without invitation, without the careful formalities that governed most interactions between someone of his standing and someone of Draven's. But 2 weeks of unanswered questions had worn away at his usual caution, replacing it with a determination he had not known he possessed. The guards at the keep's entrance recognized him, having seen him near the training yard on occasion when delivering herbs to the healer's quarters, and after a brief hesitation, one of them agreed to send word to the Alpha that an Omega named Elias requested a private audience. Elias waited in the entrance hall, his hands twisted together in front of him, his resolve wavering slightly under the weight of the grand stone architecture surrounding him, so different from the modest simplicity of his own cottage. He had never been inside the keep proper before, and the sheer scale of it, the high ceilings, the ancient tapestries depicting battles and treaties from generations past, made him acutely aware of exactly how far removed his world was from Draven's. When the guard returned and led him toward a smaller receiving room rather than the grand council chamber, Elias felt his heart climb into his throat, uncertain whether that was a good sign or simply a more private setting for whatever refusal or dismissal awaited him. Draven was already there when Elias entered, standing near a narrow window that overlooked the training yard below, his posture rigid, his expression carefully composed, in a way that immediately told Elias he had been expecting this visit, or something like it, for longer than tonight alone. "Elias," Draven said, turning to face him fully, "I wasn't told the reason for your visit." Elias took a breath, steadying himself, and decided that after 2 weeks of careful evasions and unfinished sentences, directness was the only approach left worth trying. "I think you know why I'm here, Alpha," he said, his voice steadier than he expected. "I think it's time someone finally told me the truth." Draven stood very still, the quiet receiving room suddenly feeling far too small for the weight pressing down between them. He had rehearsed a dozen different versions of this conversation over the past 2 days, careful explanations, measured admissions, ways of softening a truth that felt too large and too strange to simply say aloud. But standing here now, facing Elias's steady, unflinching gaze, every rehearsed version dissolved, leaving him with nothing but the plain, unavoidable reality of the situation. "Please sit," Draven said, gesturing toward the 2 chairs near the small hearth, though his own legs felt unsteady beneath him. "I'd rather stand," Elias said, "until I understand what's happening. Alpha, an old woman, near the well, claims she saw an unusually large wolf near my cottage 2 nights ago. Rabbits appeared on my windowsill, for over a week before that, always fresh, always placed with obvious care. You yourself visited me directly, twice now, asking questions you never quite finished. I am not foolish enough to believe these things are unrelated." Draven closed his eyes briefly, gathering whatever composure remained to him. When he opened them again, he found Elias watching him with an expression that held more curiosity than fear, more determination than the deference Draven had expected, and somehow that steadiness made the truth easier to speak rather than harder. "You're right," Draven said quietly. "They are not unrelated. The wolf the woman saw was mine." Elias's breath caught audibly, though he did not move, did not step back, simply stood there, absorbing the confirmation of something he had clearly already suspected, but had not fully allowed himself to believe. "The rabbits," Elias said slowly, "that was you." "My wolf," Draven corrected, though even as he said it, he recognized how thin the distinction had become. "Though I understand now that the distinction matters less than I once believed. He has been leaving them for you since the very first night, without my knowledge, without my permission, and without any explanation I was willing to accept until very recently." "Why?" Elias asked, though something in his tone suggested he already suspected the answer, and simply needed to hear it spoken plainly. Draven took a slow breath, forcing himself to say the word he had spent 2 weeks avoiding, wrestling with, denying, in every possible way his mind could construct. "Because he recognized you as his mate," he said, "as mine. The moment he first caught your scent, before I ever consciously noticed you at all, something in him simply knew, and every night since, he has tried to court you the only way instinct knows how, regardless of my attempts to stop him." The room fell silent except for the soft crackle of the fire in the hearth. Elias stood frozen, his expression shifting through several emotions too quickly for Draven to name them all. Shock, disbelief, and something else beneath those, something that looked almost like the same fragile hope Draven had been fighting against for 2 weeks. "That's not possible," Elias said finally, though his voice lacked the conviction the words were meant to carry. "I am an Omega, with no family standing, no political value, nothing that would make sense as a match for the Alpha King of Blackthorn Pack. Bonds like this don't happen to people like me." "I told myself the same thing," Draven admitted. "Every single night since this began, I told myself exactly that it was a mistake, a malfunction, anything other than what my wolf insisted it was. I ordered patrols to search for foxes that never existed, hoping if I simply controlled the situation carefully enough, I could make it disappear, without ever having to face what it actually meant." "And now?" Elias asked quietly. Draven met his gaze directly, allowing himself, for the first time, to stop hiding behind careful words and unfinished sentences. "Now I no longer believe I can control it, or that I even should. My wolf recognized something true, Elias, something that has nothing to do with standing or family, or the politics that usually govern who an alpha is permitted to want. He recognized you, and the longer I fought against that, the more certain I became that the fighting itself was the mistake, not the bond." Elias was quiet for a long moment, his arms wrapped around himself as though bracing against something, his eyes searching Draven's face for any sign of insincerity, any indication that this might be some cruel joke or political maneuver he did not yet understand. "Why tell me now?" Elias asked. "After 2 weeks of rabbits and patrols and half-finished sentences, why choose tonight to simply say it plainly? Because 2 nights ago, my wolf carried me to your window while I slept, and I woke crouched in the dirt, with a rabbit in my hand, having evaded every patrol I myself ordered to search for him," Draven said. "I could no longer pretend this was something happening at a distance, something I could manage through careful denial. It is happening inside me, Elias, whether I accept it or not. I decided I would rather face it honestly than continue running from something that has already chosen its course." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and unguarded, in a way that felt almost dangerous, coming from someone who had spent 6 years cultivating an image of absolute control. Elias felt something shift in his chest, the careful walls he had built around his own hope. Walls constructed from years of being taught that Omegas like him did not receive gifts like this, beginning to crack under the weight of Draven's honesty. "I don't know what to say," Elias admitted quietly. "This changes everything I thought I understood about my place here." "I know," Draven said. "I am not asking you to have an answer tonight. I am only asking that you know the truth, rather than continuing to wonder in silence while I hide behind excuses about foxes and patrols. Whatever you decide, whatever happens next, you deserved honesty, and I should have given it to you far sooner than this." Elias studied him for a long moment, the fire casting warm light across features that looked, for the first time since Elias had known him, entirely unguarded. Whatever fear he had carried into this room, whatever uncertainty had driven him to seek out this confrontation, softened slightly under the weight of Draven's raw, unpolished honesty. "I need time," Elias said finally. "This is not something I can simply accept in a single conversation, no matter how honestly it's spoken." "That's fair," Draven said, and there was no anger in his voice, only quiet understanding. "Take whatever time you need. I will not push further than you're willing to go." Elias nodded, and after a moment of hesitation, turned toward the door, his mind spinning with everything he had just learned, the careful order of his life rearranging itself around a truth he had never imagined would apply to someone like him. He paused at the threshold, glancing back one final time. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "the rabbits were the kindest thing anyone has done for me in a very long time, even before I understood what they meant." He left before Draven could respond, the door closing softly behind him, leaving the Alpha King alone in the small receiving room with nothing but the fire, his own racing thoughts, and the fragile, unfamiliar warmth of a truth finally spoken aloud. News moves quickly within pack walls, no matter how carefully guarded a conversation might seem at the time. Elias had told no one but Mira about his private audience with the Alpha King, and Mira, understanding the delicacy of the situation, had kept the secret close. Yet somehow, within 3 days, whispers had begun circulating through the Omega quarters, vague at first, half-formed rumors about the Alpha King's late-night visits, and an Omega, near the old well, who had suddenly found herself the subject of considerable attention. Elias did his best to ignore the whispers, continuing his usual routine of tending his garden, mending clothes for pack members who paid him small sums for the work, and visiting Mira in the evenings, when the day's chores were finished. But the whispers followed him regardless. Curious glances from neighbors, questions disguised as casual conversation, a growing awareness that his quiet, unremarkable life had somehow become a subject of pack-wide interest. Draven, for his part, found himself facing an entirely different kind of pressure. Elder Percival requested a private meeting 3 days after Elias's visit to the keep, and Draven, sensing the direction the conversation would inevitably take, prepared himself as best he could for a confrontation he had known was coming, since the moment Percival first raised questions in council. "There are rumors," Percival said without preamble, once the two of them were alone in his private study, a room lined floor to ceiling with old texts and pack records dating back generations. "Rumors that the Alpha King has taken a personal interest in an Omega, with no family standing, no political connections, nothing to offer this pack beyond her own quiet existence at the edge of our territory. His name is Elias," Draven said, "and whatever interest exists is not something I chose deliberately. My wolf recognized him as my mate weeks ago, before I was even willing to acknowledge it myself." Percival's expression remained carefully neutral, though something in his eyes sharpened at the confirmation. "A true mate bond," he said slowly. "That is not something easily dismissed, even by an Alpha King, with responsibilities as significant as yours." "I am not seeking to dismiss it," Draven said. "I have spent weeks trying, and I have learned that denial accomplishes nothing beyond exhausting myself and confusing everyone around me." "And yet you understand the difficulty this presents," Percival said. "An Alpha's mate is not simply a personal matter, Draven. It carries political weight, alliances, expectations from neighboring packs, who have watched your leadership carefully since your father's death. An Omega with no standing offers this pack nothing in terms of alliance or advantage. He offers honesty," Draven said, his voice firmer than he intended. "He offers a bond, my own wolf recognized as true, without any calculation of political benefit whatsoever. Perhaps that is precisely the value the old texts you keep in this study have forgotten to account for." Percival studied him for a long moment, and something in the old elder's expression shifted. Not quite approval, but something adjacent to it, a cautious respect that Draven had not expected. "You've changed since this began," Percival said. "Weeks ago, you would never have spoken to me so directly. Weeks ago, I was still trying to convince myself this wasn't happening," Draven admitted. "I no longer have the luxury of that particular denial. The Council will not accept this easily," Percival warned. "There are members among us who will see this bond as a weakness to exploit, an opportunity to question your judgment, perhaps even your fitness to continue ruling without challenge. You should prepare yourself for that reality, before this becomes public knowledge beyond idle rumor." "I understand the risk," Draven said. "I have understood it since the very beginning, which is precisely why I spent so long trying to avoid this conversation altogether. But I have decided that whatever risk exists is one I am willing to face, rather than continuing to deny a bond that has already proven itself far stronger than my own resistance." Percival was quiet for a long moment, studying Draven with the kind of careful attention that came from decades of watching alphas rise and fall under the weight of decisions exactly like this one. "Then I suggest you prepare more than simply your own resolve," he said finally. "If you intend to claim this bond openly, you will need to prepare the Council, prepare the pack, and prepare Elias himself for a transition that will not be gentle, regardless of how sincere your feelings prove to be." Draven left the meeting with Percival's warning settled heavy in his chest, but beneath the weight of it, something steadier had taken root as well. A resolve that had been building slowly over the past days, strengthening with every honest conversation, every moment he allowed himself to stop fighting against a truth his wolf had recognized from the very beginning. That evening, he found himself walking once again toward the Omega District, though this time without the excuse of patrols or investigations to justify the visit. He simply wanted to see Elias, to continue the honest conversation they had begun days earlier, to understand whether the fragile hope he had glimpsed in Elias's eyes that night in the receiving room had survived the intervening days of whispers and uncertainty. He found Elias sitting outside his cottage in the fading evening light, a basket of mending in his lap, though his hands had gone still, his attention drifting toward the tree line with an expression that suggested his thoughts were far from the work in front of him. "You look deep in thought," Draven said, approaching slowly, giving Elias ample time to notice his arrival rather than startling him. Elias looked up, and something in his expression softened slightly at the sight of him, though wariness remained close beneath the surface. "I've had a great deal to think about," he said. "The whole district seems to have noticed your interest in me, Alpha. It's difficult to think clearly with so many eyes watching." "I'm sorry for that," Draven said, sitting carefully in the chair beside him, the same worn wooden seat he had occupied during his first hesitant visit. "I never intended for this to become a public spectacle before you'd had the chance to decide anything for yourself. And yet here we are," Elias said, though there was no real bitterness in his tone, only a tired honesty that matched Draven's own. "Percival paid you a visit, I take it. I heard from Mira that the council has begun discussing rumors." "He did," Draven confirmed. "He warned me the council would not accept this bond easily, that there would be members eager to use it against me." "And what did you tell him?" Elias asked. "That I understood the risk, and that I intended to face it regardless," Draven said. "Because the alternative, denying what my wolf has already proven beyond any doubt, is no longer something I am willing to attempt." Elias set the mending basket aside, turning to face him fully, his expression a careful mixture of hope and lingering caution. "You understand what you're asking of me, Draven. Choosing this openly, it would not be a quiet, private thing. Every eye in this pack, and likely several neighboring packs as well, would be watching to see whether an Omega with no standing could survive the weight of that scrutiny." "I understand," Draven said quietly, "and I would not ask you to carry that weight without standing directly beside you through every moment of it. Whatever the council decides, whatever consequences arise, I do not intend to face them without you, nor do I intend to let you face them alone." Elias studied him for a long moment, the evening light catching the sincerity in his expression, and something in his chest, some final wall of doubt he had been carrying since the very first rabbit appeared on his windowsill, finally began to give way. "Then perhaps," Elias said slowly, "it's time we stopped letting fear decide this for us." The council chamber had never felt so crowded to Draven, though the number of people present was no different from any other formal session. Word had spread throughout the pack in the days following his conversation with Elias, and by the time the council convened to formally address the matter, nearly every seat along the chamber's outer benches had filled with warriors, elders, and pack members, curious enough to witness whatever decision would emerge from the discussion. Elder Percival sat at the center of the long table, flanked by the other senior council members, his expression carefully neutral despite the tension radiating through the room. Draven stood rather than sat, positioned at the head of the chamber, where he could address the full gathering directly, Corwin standing close beside him in silent support. "The matter before this council," Percival began, his voice carrying easily through the hushed chamber, "concerns the Alpha King's intention to formally claim a mate bond with an Omega of no recorded family standing. This is not without precedent in the broader history of our kind, but it is exceedingly rare among ruling Alphas, and it carries significant implications for this pack's political standing among our neighbors." A murmur moved through the gathered crowd, and Draven caught sight of several council members exchanging pointed glances, their disapproval evident even without words. One of them, an older Alpha named Garrick who had served on the council since before Draven's father's rule, rose from his seat, without waiting to be formally recognized. "With respect, Alpha," Garrick said, his tone carrying an edge that made the word respect feel more like a formality than genuine sentiment. "This pack has spent 6 years building trade agreements and alliances, based on the strength and stability of your leadership. A mate bond to an Omega, with no standing risks, undermining the confidence our allies have placed in this pack. The Ashwood delegation arrives within the week for the Harvest Festival. What message does this send them?" "The message that this Alpha values truth over convenience," Draven said, his voice steady, despite the weight of dozens of watching eyes. "My wolf recognized Elias as my true mate, weeks ago, Garrick. That recognition does not consult political calculations, nor does it wait for convenient timing. I spent weeks attempting to deny it precisely because I understood the political concerns you're raising now, and I found that denial served no one, least of all this pack. A mate bond can be delayed. another council member offered. An elder woman named Fenwick, who had always struck Draven as more pragmatic than hostile. Acknowledged privately perhaps, but formalized at a time better suited to the pack's political needs. Surely there is a middle path that honors the bond, without exposing this pack to unnecessary risk. There is no honoring a bond by hiding it, Draven said. I have hidden this for weeks already, and the cost of that hiding fell not on me, but on Elias, who endured public scrutiny and cruel rumor, while I hesitated to speak plainly. I will not ask him to continue bearing that cost, simply because timing might prove more politically convenient at some later date. Percival raised a hand, quieting the murmurs that had begun rippling through the chamber once again. The council's concerns are not without merit, Draven, but I would remind everyone present that a true mate bond, once formed, cannot simply be dissolved through political convenience. History has shown us that alphas who deny such bonds for the sake of appearances often pay a far steeper price than the one they sought to avoid: weakened leadership, a wolf in constant conflict with its human half, instability that ultimately harms the pack far more than an unconventional mate ever could. Then you support this? Garrick asked, turning toward Percival with obvious surprise. I support honesty, Percival said carefully. Whether this council approves or disapproves of the Alpha's choice, the bond exists regardless of our opinion. The question before us is not whether the bond is real, but whether this council will stand beside our Alpha as he navigates its consequences, or whether we will spend our energy fighting a truth that cannot be undone by argument alone. The chamber fell into uneasy silence, the weight of Percival's words settling over the gathered crowd. Draven glanced toward the entrance of the chamber, where he knew Elias waited just beyond the doors, having insisted on being present for this discussion, rather than allowing it to unfold entirely without him, a decision Draven had initially resisted out of concern for Elias's safety, but ultimately respected, once he understood how important it was for Elias to have a voice in a matter that would reshape his entire life. I would like Elias to address the council directly, Draven said, if the council is willing to hear him. A ripple of surprise moved through the chamber, several council members exchanging startled glances at the unusual request. Omegas rarely, if ever, addressed the full council directly, and the suggestion clearly unsettled several of the more traditional members present, but Percival, after a moment of consideration, nodded slowly. Let him speak, Percival said. This bond concerns him as much as it concerns the Alpha. It seems only fitting that his voice be heard. The doors opened, and Elias entered the chamber, his posture straight despite the obvious nervousness in his eyes, walking the length of the room until he stood beside Draven, facing the assembled council with a steadiness that surprised even himself. I did not ask for this, Elias said, his voice carrying clearly despite its quiet start. I did not seek out the Alpha King's attention, nor did I have any expectation that a bond like this could exist between someone of my standing and someone of his. But it exists regardless of what either of us expected, and I have spent the past weeks learning that fear, of what others might think, is a poor reason to reject something true. He paused, gathering himself before continuing. I understand the concerns raised here today. I understand that I bring no family alliances, no political advantage, nothing this council would normally consider valuable in an Alpha's mate. But I would ask this council to consider what value honesty carries, what strength a leader gains from a mate who stands beside him, not for political gain, but because a bond deeper than calculation drew them together, despite every obstacle placed in the way. The chamber remained silent for a long moment after he finished speaking, the weight of his words settling over the gathered council, in a way that Draven had not fully anticipated. Even Garrick, who had spoken most forcefully against the bond, seemed to hesitate, his earlier certainty visibly shaken by the quiet conviction in Elias's voice. Percival rose slowly from his seat, his gaze moving between Draven and Elias, with an expression that finally seemed to carry genuine warmth rather than mere political calculation. This council cannot undo a true mate bond, he said, nor, I think, should it try. The question before us was never truly whether this bond exists, but whether we choose to stand with our Alpha as he honors it, or whether we allow fear of what others might think to divide this pack at exactly the moment unity matters most. He turned to address the full chamber. I move that this council formally recognize Elias as the Alpha King's true mate, with all the standing and protection that recognition carries. The vote, when it came, was not unanimous. Garrick and 2 other council members voted against the recognition, their disapproval evident in stiff postures and tight expressions. But the majority carried the decision forward, and as Percival announced the result, Draven felt something in his chest loosen, a tension he had carried for weeks, finally beginning to ease. He turned to Elias, searching his face for reaction, and found something there that mirrored his own overwhelming relief, disbelief, slowly giving way to something warmer, something that looked almost like hope, finally allowed to breathe freely after weeks of careful restraint. The Harvest Festival arrived within the week, bringing with it delegations from 3 neighboring packs, including the Ashwood representatives, whose trade agreement had occupied so much of the council's attention in recent months. The pack grounds transformed for the occasion, long tables set beneath strings of lanterns, the scent of roasted meat and fresh bread drifting through the evening air, musicians tuning their instruments near the edge of the gathering. Elias stood near the edge of the festivities, dressed in clothing finer than anything he had ever owned, a gift from Draven that had arrived at his cottage 3 days earlier, along with a note expressing hope, rather than expectation, that Elias might wear it if he felt ready. He had hesitated before accepting it, still adjusting to the strange new reality of his life, the whispers that had shifted from cruel speculation to something closer to curious respect, the sudden attention from pack members who had never once acknowledged his existence before. Mira found him there, her own excitement barely contained as she took in the transformed grounds around them. "I still can't quite believe it," she said, looping her arm through his. 3 weeks ago, you were convinced a fox was leaving rabbits at your window." 3 weeks ago, I was convinced a lot of things that turned out to be wrong, Elias said, a small smile tugging at his mouth, despite the nervousness still fluttering in his chest. "Are you ready for tonight?" Mira asked, her tone gentling slightly, sensing the anxiety beneath his composed exterior. "I don't know," Elias admitted. "Everything is happening so quickly. Weeks ago I was invisible to this entire pack, and now half the region will be watching whatever happens tonight." Before Mira could respond, movement near the center of the gathering drew both their attention, and Elias felt his breath catch as Draven made his way through the crowd toward them, dressed in formal attire that marked him clearly as Alpha King, yet his expression, when his eyes found Elias, held none of the careful distance Elias remembered from their first hesitant conversations weeks earlier. "May I borrow him?" Draven asked Mira, a hint of genuine warmth in his voice that had rarely been present during his earlier, more guarded visits. Mira laughed softly and released Elias's arm. "Take good care of him," she said, though her tone made clear the words carried real meaning beneath their lightness. Draven led Elias toward the center of the gathering, where the musicians had begun a slower melody, couples drifting into the open space to dance beneath the lantern light. He turned to face Elias fully, offering his hand with a formality that somehow felt more genuine than any grand gesture could have. "The whole pack is watching," Elias murmured, glancing around at the curious eyes already turning in their direction. "Let them watch," Draven said. "I spent weeks hiding what my wolf already knew. Weeks that cost you far more than they cost me. I don't intend to hide any longer, not tonight, not for whatever comes after." Elias took his hand, and together they moved into the open space, the crowd parting naturally to give them room, murmurs rippling outward as pack members and visiting delegates alike began to understand exactly what they were witnessing. Draven Blackthorn, Alpha King of one of the strongest packs in the region, dancing openly, publicly, with the Omega his wolf had chosen weeks earlier through fresh rabbits left in the quiet dark of night. "Do you remember what you told me?" Draven asked quietly as they moved together. "That first night I finally told you the truth. You said the rabbits were the kindest thing anyone had done for you in a long time, even before you understood what they meant." "I remember," Elias said. "I want you to know," Draven continued, "that whatever comes next, whatever challenges this bond still faces, that kindness was never calculated. My wolf didn't choose you because it was easy, or convenient, or wise. He chose you because something true recognized something true, and no amount of denial on my part could change that fact." Elias felt warmth spread through his chest, chasing away the last remaining traces of doubt that had lingered since that very first frightened night, waking to find a stranger's gift resting on his windowsill. "I think," he said slowly, "that I've spent my whole life believing I wasn't meant for anything remarkable. It's strange, learning otherwise." Not strange, Draven said. Overdue, perhaps, but not strange. The dance continued, the crowd's initial shock slowly giving way to something warmer, murmurs of surprise shifting into quiet approval, as pack members who had known Elias for years, who had watched him move invisibly through pack life without ever truly seeing him, began to understand what their Alpha King had recognized weeks earlier, in a small garden at the edge of the Omega District. Later that evening, as the celebration continued around them, Elias found himself standing once again near his own cottage, Draven beside him, the noise of the festival still audible in the distance. He glanced toward his window, remembering the very first rabbit, the fear and confusion it had sparked, the weeks of careful denial and slow, halting honesty that had followed. "I have something for you," Draven said, reaching into the pocket of his formal coat. Elias raised an eyebrow, curious despite himself. "Another rabbit?" Draven laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that Elias realized he had never actually heard before, not in all their weeks of careful, tension-filled conversations. "Not tonight," he said, producing instead a small, carefully carved wooden token, the kind traditionally exchanged between mates as a symbol of formal claiming. "Though I suspect my wolf might insist on returning to old habits eventually, once he's satisfied that his intentions have finally been properly understood." Elias took the token carefully, turning it over in his hands, feeling the weight of everything it represented settle into place, not as a burden, but as something steady and real, a foundation built from honesty rather than convenience or calculation. "I think," Elias said softly, looking up to meet Draven's eyes, "that I could learn to live with a wolf who insists on old habits." They stood together in the quiet evening light, the festival's warmth glowing distant behind them, two lives that had seemed impossibly separate weeks earlier, now woven together by a bond neither of them had chosen consciously, but both had ultimately chosen to honor. And somewhere nearby, beneath the surface of Draven's calm, contented expression, his wolf settled into a satisfaction so complete it needed no further words, no further gifts, no further proof. It had found what it was searching for, and this time, nothing stood in the way of keeping it.